She came home to find another woman sitting in her mother's chair. Victoria Ashford stepped into Ashford Manor at 7:12 in the evening, just as a toast rose from the dining room, like crystal breaking softly under candlelight. The mansion was glowing from the inside out. Chandeliers lit above the oak staircase, blue velvet drapes pulled back from tall windows, silver trays moving through the hall, the scent of roasted herbs and white roses drifting from the formal dining room. For a moment, no one in the foyer noticed her. That was the first insult. The second waited beyond the double doors. Serena Vale sat at the head of the long mahogany table, wearing a champagne satin dress and holding one of Victoria's grandmother's crystal glasses as if it had been poured for her by birthright. Around her sat Julian's investors, society friends, and two couples Victoria recognized from charity boards that had once begged her mother for donations. The table had been set with the Ashford family china, the ivory set painted with a thin gold rim, reserved for anniversaries, memorial dinners, and the rare nights when Victoria's mother wanted the house to remember it had survived more than wealth. Tonight, Serena had placed white orchids in the center, removed the deep green candles Victoria preferred, and moved Victoria's seating car to the final chair near the service door. Serena lifted her glass and smiled at the room. "To new traditions in this house," she said. A few guests raised their glasses before they saw Victoria standing in the doorway. The sound faded piece by piece. Julian Ashford stood beside Serena's chair in a black dinner jacket, one hand resting near the back of it, his face arranged into that elegant stillness he used whenever shame needed to look like control. He saw his wife. He saw where her card had been placed. He saw Serena sitting where Victoria's mother had sat for 30 years. And he said nothing. Serena turned slowly, her smile brightening with practiced surprise. "Oh, Victoria," she said, her voice sweet enough for witnesses and sharp enough for the wound. "We did not expect you at dinner." The guests looked down at menus, glasses, napkins, anything except the woman whose house had just been used to erase her. Victoria did not answer at once. Her eyes moved along the walls, past the oil portrait of her mother above the sideboard, past the brass sconces her grandfather had brought from London, past Mrs. Wickham and the staff standing against the far wall in perfect silence. They were not watching Serena. They were watching Victoria. That was the only thing in the room that still felt true. Serena set down her glass and gestured lightly toward the end of the table. "Of course, if you would like to stay, we made room for you." Made room. In Ashford Manor. In the house built by Victoria's grandfather, held in her family trust, maintained by her payroll, protected by staff who had served her family before Julian learned how to pronounce the wine cellar labels. Victoria looked at the seating card near the service door, then back at Julian. His jaw tightened, but still he did not move. The humiliation was quiet, expensive, and perfectly arranged. Victoria stepped into the dining room, the chandelier light catching the edge of her black evening dress. She placed her clutch on the table beside the head chair, not the empty one at the end, and asked softly, "Did you tell her whose house she is hosting in?" Julian did not answer quickly, and in that small delay, the whole dining room seemed to understand that the question had not been asked for drama. It had been asked because something in the room was built on a lie. Serena's fingers tightened around the stem of her crystal glass, but her smile stayed almost perfect. Almost. Victoria kept her clutch beside the head chair and looked past the table toward the portrait of her mother above the sideboard. Margaret Ashford had been painted in a dark green gown, one hand resting on the back of that very chair, her expression composed in the old way of women who understood wealth was not noise, but stewardship. Beneath the portrait, the family silver reflected candlelight in long, cold lines. Victoria remembered being 7 years old, standing beside her mother as Mrs. Wickham taught her how to place the fish fork to the left of the dinner fork, because Ashford Manor did not confuse care with display. She remembered running one hand along the oak banister after piano lessons, the wood warm from afternoon sun. She remembered her grandfather telling her that a house like this was not owned by the loudest person inside it. It was kept by the one willing to protect its history when everyone else wanted to use it. Julian had not known any of that when he first arrived at Ashford Manor 15 years earlier. Back then, he was handsome, ambitious, and slightly overwhelmed by the scale of the place. He had walked through the entrance hall with his hand hovering near the carved rail, as if touching too much might reveal he did not belong yet. Victoria had loved that humility. She had mistaken it for reverence. Over the years, he learned the house. Not its heart, only its advantages. He learned which investor liked dinner beneath the Venetian chandelier. He learned which senator preferred the library over the drawing room. He learned that photographs taken on the South Terrace made him look inherited, established, untouchable. Victoria had let him host meetings here, then charity dinners, then private negotiations that ended with men praising his taste. She never corrected them when they called it his estate. At first, silence felt generous. Later, it became the room he used to erase her. Serena leaned back in the head chair and gave a light laugh, trying to turn the moment into manners. Victoria, surely we do not need to make this uncomfortable. Julian invited me to help him host. The word host moved across the table and landed among the china, the silverware, the folded napkins embroidered with Victoria's family crest. Mrs. Whitcomb lowered her eyes for 1 second, not in obedience to Serena, but in restraint. The rest of the staff stood still along the wall, each of them wearing the quiet discipline of people who had served 3 generations and knew when a room was insulting itself. Julian finally spoke. Serena is helping me keep tonight civilized. Victoria turned to him. Civilized? He glanced toward the guests, annoyed that she had made the private shape of his betrayal visible beneath public light. This dinner matters, he said softly. These people are important. Victoria looked around the table. Important people, sitting beneath her mother's portrait, drinking from her grandmother's crystal, watching another woman occupy her chair. Then she looked back at Julian. And I am not. No one moved. Serena's smile thinned. Julian lowered his voice. Do not turn this into ownership. Victoria rested one hand on the back of the head chair, the one Serena had no right to occupy, and her expression became so calm that even the candles seemed to stop trembling. In this house, she said, everything is about authority. The word authority did not rise in the room. It settled. It moved over the china, over the crystal, over the faces of people who had arrived expecting an elegant dinner and had found themselves seated inside a marriage cracking beneath candlelight. Serena recovered first, because women like her knew how to mistake silence for permission. She placed her glass down with a soft click and looked toward Mrs. Whitcomb. I think we are ready for the first course, she said. And please switch the Sancerre for the Montrachet. Julian mentioned the guests prefer something more impressive. Mrs. Whitcomb did not move. Not immediately. The pause was barely 2 seconds, but inside Ashford Manor, 2 seconds from the head housekeeper meant something. Victoria saw it. Julian saw it too, and his mouth tightened. Serena's smile remained in place, but her eyes sharpened. Mrs. Whitcomb, Serena repeated, a little brighter this time, as though sweetness could become command if polished hard enough. The soup can wait. Bring the Montrachet. One of Julian's investors glanced toward the wine glasses. Another guest shifted in his chair. The staff along the wall remained composed, hands folded, faces neutral, every one of them trained not only in service, but in discretion. They had served funerals in this room, Christmas dinners, charity evenings, and the night Victoria's mother came downstairs after surgery wearing pearls because she refused to let illness teach the house despair. They knew where every silver spoon belonged. They also knew who had the right to ask for it. Julian stepped closer to Victoria, lowering his voice as if lowering it could shrink the insult. Do not do this now, he said. She looked at him without turning her body away from the head chair. Do what? Embarrass everyone? His gaze flicked toward Serena, then the guests, then the portrait above the sideboard. The dinner is important. Serena is trying to help. Victoria's eyes moved to the seating card at the far end of the table, her name written in black ink beside the service door like an afterthought. Help whom? She asked. Julian exhaled slowly. You have been distant for months. Someone had to make this house feel alive. A quiet breath passed through the staff line. Not loud, not disrespectful, but Victoria heard it. Mrs. Whitcomb's expression did not change, yet her fingers folded more tightly at her waist. Serena stood then, graceful and sure, one hand resting on the back of the head chair, as if she had earned the wood beneath her palm. Victoria, she said, no one is trying to erase you. We are simply creating a warmer future here. The old ways can feel very heavy to people who were not raised under them. The sentence was careful enough to sound polite and cruel enough to do its work. Victoria felt the sting behind her eyes, not because Serena mattered, but because Julian let the words stand between the chandelier and her mother's portrait. He let a guest talk about the Ashford women as though they were dust on inherited furniture. He let another woman place herself in the chair where grief had been held with dignity, where family decisions had been made, where staff had once brought tea when Victoria signed the papers after her mother died. Victoria did not look away from Serena. "The old ways kept this house standing," she said. Serena gave a small laugh, almost pitying. "Then perhaps they can keep standing from the end of the table tonight." Julian's face shifted, but still he did not correct her. That was the moment Victoria stopped waiting for him to remember who she was. She turned her head slightly toward Mrs. Whitcomb, and for the first time that evening, the head housekeeper lifted her eyes fully. Victoria's voice stayed calm. "Mrs. Whitcomb, before dinner is served, please ask the staff to remain present." Serena's smile faltered. Julian whispered, "Victoria." But Victoria looked only at the woman who had run Ashford Manor longer than Serena had known its address. "Staff always know who holds the keys," she said. 3 months before that dinner, Victoria first understood that Serena was not merely entering her marriage. She was being handed rooms. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning in Manhattan, while Victoria sat alone at the breakfast table beneath the smaller chandelier in the East Parlor, reading through household invoices with coffee cooling beside her untouched toast. The mansion was quiet then, quiet enough for the old pipes to hum behind the walls and for footsteps to sound honest. An email arrived from Lily, one of the junior housekeepers, forwarded without comment except for a single line at the top. "Mrs. Ashford, I was uncertain whether this instruction was approved by you." Victoria opened the message. It was from Serena Vale. The tone was polished, confident, and already familiar with things she had no right to touch. Staff uniforms should be softened for private dinners. The master suite linens should be changed to white and champagne. The green candles in the dining room felt dated. The seating protocol needed to be more flexible. Wine cellar access should be made available before Julian's investor dinner. At the bottom of the thread was Julian's reply, sent from his private account in 6 careless words. "Follow Serena's direction for tonight." Victoria did not move for a long time. Rain tapped against the tall windows. Somewhere in the back hall, Mrs. Whitcomb spoke softly to a florist about the weekly arrangements, her voice as steady as it had been when Victoria was a child hiding under the staircase during adult dinners. The hurt was not loud. It was precise. It did not come from the linens, or the candles, or even the wine cellar. It came from the way Julian had written the order as if Ashford Manor were his to delegate, as if Serena could be placed inside the house by sentence, as if Victoria's authority could be overwritten because no one expected her to check the ink. She printed the email and placed it inside a gray folder. Then she called Thomas Reed. His office was on the 34th floor of a glass building overlooking Park Avenue, but his files smelled faintly of old paper and leather, the scent of families that had learned to survive through clauses instead of speeches. Thomas had represented the Ashford estate since Victoria was in college. He had sat beside her mother during the final trust revisions. He had watched Victoria sign inheritance documents with one hand trembling and her face calm because grief had not given her permission to fall apart in public. When she laid Serena's email on his desk, he read it once. Then he read Julian's reply again. His expression did not harden. It cooled. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "does your husband believe he has household command?" Victoria looked out the window at the wet city below. "I think he believes no one will correct him." Thomas opened the estate file. Ashford Manor Deed. Ashford Family Trust. Prenuptial Property Schedule. Household Payroll Authority. Staff Charter. Private Cellar Access. Event Approval Provisions. One by one, he placed the papers across his desk, not dramatically, but with the quiet rhythm of someone setting foundation stones back into place. The mansion, the grounds, the staff payroll, and the operational authority all remained under Victoria's trust control. Julian had residence privilege as her spouse. He did not have estate command. Serena had nothing. Not title. Not delegated authority. Not the right to redirect staff. Not the right to alter household protocol. Thomas tapped the printed email with one finger. "This is not hostess behavior," he said. "This is an attempted transfer of authority without consent." Victoria stared at Julian's 6 words until they blurred slightly. "Follow Serena's direction for tonight." She folded the paper once, very neatly, and slid it back into the folder. Then we will let tonight show exactly what he tried to give away. Thomas Reed did not rush the explanation, and that made the truth feel heavier. He turned the first document so Victoria could read the county stamp at the top, then placed the trust certificate beside it with the care of a man setting down something older than a marriage. Ashford Manor is held by the Ashford Family Trust, he said. You are the sole beneficiary with controlling residential and operational authority. The mansion itself, the south lawn, the carriage house, the private cellar, the staff payroll, and the household accounts are all administered through the trust. Julian has spousal residence privilege because you allowed him to live there as your husband. That is not ownership. That is not command. Victoria looked at the page. The words were dry, formal, almost cold, but they reached into her with a steadiness no apology ever had. Controlling authority, event approval, staff direction, household operations. She had seen those phrases years ago and barely understood how much love had made her willing to forget them. When she married Julian, she had not wanted the house to become a wall between them. She had wanted it to become shelter. She had given him the library for client calls, the terrace for investor receptions, the blue salon for private dinners, the wine cellar for men who praised his taste while drinking bottles purchased by her family before he arrived. She had given him access, and he had slowly mistaken access for possession. Thomas opened the prenuptial schedule next. The Ashford estate assets remained separate property under the trust structure, he continued. There was no transfer to Julian. There was no joint title. There was no refinancing that brought him into the property chain. He cannot assign hosting rights. He cannot direct staff against your wishes. He cannot give Serena access to private household areas or authorize changes to mansion protocol. Victoria thought of Serena's email asking for white and champagne linens in the master suite. She thought of the green candles being called dated, the staff uniforms softened, the wine cellar opened as if heritage were a cabinet someone could unlock after flirting with power. The smallest details suddenly felt large because every one of them had been a rehearsal. Serena had not asked to attend dinner. She had practiced being obeyed. Thomas slid another document forward. This is the household staff charter your mother revised shortly before she died. All permanent staff report to the trust-appointed household authority. That authority is you, unless you appoint a steward in writing. Have you done that? No, Victoria said. Her voice came out quiet, but clean. Thomas nodded. Then Mrs. Whitcomb does not answer to Julian in matters of estate command. She may accommodate ordinary family requests, but she is not required to obey a third party, and Serena is not recognized anywhere in these documents. The name Serena looked strange in the room, almost flimsy against the paper history around it. Victoria let her fingers rest near the printed email Julian had sent. Follow Serena's direction for tonight. 6 words. 6 careless words that tried to move a woman into a place generations had protected for her. Thomas watched her for a moment, then softened his tone. Victoria, many people confuse marriage with authority because no one challenges the performance. Your husband can stand in a dining room and act like a host. That does not make him the owner of the house. Serena can sit at the head of the table. That does not make the chair hers. Victoria looked down at her mother's signature on the staff charter, elegant and firm in dark ink. She remembered her mother saying that a house did not need to shout to know its own name. For the first time in months, the ache inside her did not feel like weakness. It felt like a door closing carefully. Thomas gathered the documents into a leather folder. If they proceed with this dinner, let them do it publicly. Let Serena issue instructions. Let Julian allow it. Let the guests hear who claims what. Then Mrs. Whitcomb can follow the estate protocol exactly. Victoria lifted her eyes. What protocol? Thomas closed the folder with a soft snap. When the legal household authority enters Ashford Manor, the staff acknowledge her first. Victoria left Thomas Reed's office with the leather folder against her side and the strange calm of a woman who had stopped mistaking patience for surrender. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved beneath gray afternoon light, yellow cabs sliding along Park Avenue, umbrellas opening and closing like small dark flowers in the rain. Her phone buzzed before she reached the elevator. It was another message from Lily, the junior housekeeper, this time with a photograph attached. The formal dining room at Ashford Manor had already been changed. White orchids where her mother's gardenias should have been. Champagne napkins where the deep green linen had always gone. The Ashford family china taken from the locked cabinet. And at the head of the table, placed with neat little confidence, was Serena Vale's handwritten seating card. Victoria looked at the image for a long moment. Not because the table surprised her, but because it confirmed something Julian had worked very hard to keep soft around the edges. He was not only betraying her trust, he was letting another woman rehearse command in the rooms Victoria's family had built to outlast men who confused charm with ownership. She did not call him. She did not call Serena. She did not ask who had approved the orchids or who had opened the china cabinet. Instead, she sent the photograph to Thomas. His reply came almost immediately. Keep every message. Attend dinner. Let the claim be made in front of witnesses. A second message followed. I will have the estate notice ready. Victoria sat in the back of her car as it pulled from the curb, rain threading down the window between her and the city. She opened Mrs. Whitcomb's contact and typed carefully. If tonight proceeds, do not argue with Ms. Vale. Do not correct her prematurely. Keep the staff present in the dining room when I arrive. Follow household protocol exactly. For nearly a minute, no reply came. Victoria watched brake lights blur red along the wet street and thought of Mrs. Whitcomb as she had been when Victoria was 10, buttoning Victoria's navy coat before a school recital because her mother had been trapped on a charity board call. She thought of the woman standing at the back of the church during her mother's funeral, not crying publicly, but holding Victoria's gloves in both hands as though service could become grief when words could not. Then the reply appeared. The staff remember, ma'am. Victoria read it twice. The words were not sentimental. That made them stronger. By 5:30 that evening, Ashford Manor was preparing for a dinner that believed itself already victorious. Florists moved through the service entrance. Caterers polished silver under Serena's instructions. A wine assistant brought bottles up from the private cellar after Julian sent a message saying it was fine. Serena walked the length of the dining room in a pale wrap dress, approving place cards, touching chair backs, asking if the portraits could be better lit. Mrs. Whitcomb answered each request with flawless courtesy and documented every change in the household log. At 6:40, Thomas Reed called Victoria from his office. The notice is printed, he said. The trust documents are in order. If Julian allows Serena to assert household authority tonight, the staff charter gives you immediate basis to correct the command structure in the room. Victoria stood in her dressing room, fastening pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother. Her black evening dress was simple, long-sleeved, and quiet enough to make the jewels look inherited rather than displayed. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw no rage there. Only tiredness, and beneath it, a clean line of resolve. I do not want a scene, she said. Thomas answered, then do not create one. Let them create it. At 7:05, Victoria's car turned through the iron gates of Ashford Manor. The mansion glowed beyond the rain-dark lawn, every window golden, every chandelier lit, every room pretending not to know who it belonged to. Victoria stepped out beneath the porte-cochere, took one breath of cold air, and walked inside carrying nothing but her clutch, her mother's pearls, and the authority Julian had forgotten was never his to give away. The dining room remained too quiet after Victoria's request, as if even the chandelier understood that the evening had crossed from insult into record. Mrs. Whitcomb gave one small nod, then turned slightly toward the staff lined along the wall. No one left. No one served. No one answered Serena's earlier command. The soup stayed hidden behind the service doors. The wine remained untouched in its silver cooler, and the guests sat between polished plates and folded napkins with the helpless posture of people who had realized manners could not save them from truth. Serena looked around the table, measuring the silence, then stood taller at the head chair. She had not won the room, so she tried to perform as though she had. Her champagne satin dress caught the candlelight. Her diamond bracelet flashed as she lifted her glass again, and her smile returned with enough force to look almost painful. Well, she said lightly, since everyone is here, perhaps we should remember why tonight matters. Julian's investors looked relieved for half a second, grateful for a voice that sounded like dinner could still continue. Serena turned toward them, choosing warmth the way someone chooses a weapon and wraps it in ribbon. Ashford Manor has always been beautiful, she said, glancing toward the portrait above the sideboard. But beautiful houses can become cold when people stop living in them. I think everyone here can feel that this place is ready for something fresh. A woman who can make it feel alive again. The words moved through the room and found Victoria exactly where Serena meant them to land. At the edge of the head chair. Beside her own clutch. Under her mother's painted gaze. Julian looked down at his wine glass. Not at Serena. Not at Victoria. Down. That was worse than a defense. It was permission made elegant. Victoria felt the old ache open in her chest, but she kept her face still. She had learned from her mother that dignity did not mean the absence of pain. It meant pain did not get to choose your posture. Serena continued, encouraged by Julian's silence. I know tradition means a great deal to some people, but sometimes a house needs a new hand, a lighter touch, a different kind of hostess. A few guests smiled weakly. One woman near the middle of the table lowered her eyes to the china pattern, perhaps realizing too late that the gold rim beneath her fingers belonged to the woman being erased in front of her. Serena then looked directly at Victoria and gestured toward the final chair beside the service door, where Victoria's name card still waited like a public demotion. You are welcome to stay, of course, if you are comfortable there. The sentence was quiet enough to be polite and clear enough to be cruel. Julian's hand tightened around the stem of his glass, but he still did not correct her. Victoria did not look at the last chair. She looked at the head chair, at Serena's fingers resting on its carved back, at the same curve of wood where her mother's hand had rested during holiday dinners and foundation meetings, and the last family Christmas before illness made the house whisper. Then Victoria placed her palm gently over her clutch on the table, anchoring herself to the place Serena thought she could borrow. I am comfortable where I belong, she said. Serena's smile thinned. Julian finally leaned toward her, his voice low and tense. Victoria, let us not ruin the evening. She turned her eyes to him, calm and bright, with something colder than tears. You let her move my name to the service door, she said. You let her raise a toast in my mother's chair. You let her call my house cold because it would not recognize her. The room did not breathe. Serena opened her mouth, but before she could speak, Mrs. Wickham stepped forward from the wall. Not quickly, not dramatically, just one measured step, the sound of her shoes soft against the old floor. Behind her, every member of the staff straightened. Victoria saw Serena notice it then. The shift, the line, the invisible loyalty that had been present since the moment Victoria entered, waiting only for the proper time to reveal itself. Outside the tall windows, rain moved against the glass in thin silver lines. Inside, Serena still stood at the head of the table, but the room had begun to turn away from her without anyone moving a chair. Mrs. Wickham did not look at Serena when she stepped forward. That was the first thing everyone noticed. The head housekeeper crossed the dining room with the same measured grace she had used for 30 years, past the untouched soup bowls, past the silver wine cooler, past Serena standing at the head of the table as though posture could become proof. The staff moved behind her in a quiet line. Footmen, servers, the senior housekeeper, the cellar assistant, even Lily from the back hall, each one stopping not beside Serena, not beside Julian, but in front of Victoria Ashford. For one suspended second, the room held its breath. Then Mrs. Wickham bowed. Not a small nod, not a polite acknowledgement. A full, formal bow from the woman who had opened Ashford Manor every morning since Victoria was a girl. Behind her, every member of the staff bowed with her. Crystal stopped near lips. Silverware froze above plates. Serena's face changed before she could arrange it back into beauty. Julian went completely still. Mrs. Wickham lifted her eyes to Victoria and said, "Welcome home, madam." The words entered the dining room like a key turning in an old lock. No one spoke. The rain tapped softly against the windows. The chandelier light trembled across the gold-rimmed china, and for the first time that evening, every guest understood that the staff had not been waiting to serve dinner. They had been waiting to recognize the owner. Serena forced a laugh, thin and uncertain. "Mrs. Wickham, that is enough. Please serve the first course." But Mrs. Wickham did not turn. She remained facing Victoria. Julian stepped forward, his voice low and warning. "Eleanor, do not make this difficult." For the first time, Mrs. Wickham looked at him, not with disrespect, but with the calm distance of someone correcting a guest who had forgotten the house rules. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "household service awaits instruction from Mrs. Ashford." A sound moved around the table, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper, but the sudden rearrangement of status. Serena looked at Julian. He did not meet her eyes. Victoria stood beside the head chair, one hand still resting lightly near her clutch. She felt the ache in her chest, but it no longer controlled the room. It had become something quieter, something clean. Then the double doors opened again. Thomas Reed entered in a dark suit, carrying the leather folder Victoria had seen in his office. He stopped near the sideboard beneath Margaret Ashford's portrait and inclined his head to Victoria before addressing the room. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, though his voice carried no apology at all. "I am counsel for the Ashford Family Trust. For clarity, Ashford Manor, the household staff payroll, the private cellar, event approval, and operational command remain under the authority of Victoria Ashford, sole controlling beneficiary of the trust. Mr. Ashford holds residence privilege only. He does not hold estate command. Ms. Vale holds no household authority." The words landed one by one. Residence privilege. No estate command. No household authority. Serena's hand slipped from the back of the head chair. Julian's mouth opened, but no defense arrived quickly enough to save him. Thomas placed the estate notice on the table, exactly between the crystal glass Serena had raised and the seating card she had moved. Victoria looked at the card with her name near the service door, then at the chair her mother had once occupied. The room had frozen around her, but she did not feel cold anymore. She looked at Mrs. Whitcomb and said softly, "Please reset the table." Mrs. Whitcomb moved first, and the rest of the staff followed with the quiet precision of people restoring something that had never truly belonged out of place. One server lifted Serena's seating card from the head chair. Another removed Victoria's card from the far end of the table near the service door. No one hurried. That made it worse for Serena. Every movement was polite, exact, and final. The room watched as the two small cards changed places, as if the entire evening could be corrected by ink returning to the proper chair. Serena stood beside the head of the table with one hand lowered at her side, her smile gone, the champagne satin of her dress suddenly too bright beneath the chandelier. She looked at Julian, waiting for him to save the performance he had helped create. He looked at Thomas Reed's estate notice instead. Julian finally found his voice. "Victoria, this is unnecessary. We can discuss this privately." Victoria looked at him across the table, past the gold-rimmed china, past the crystal glass Serena had used for her toast, past the guests who had grown very still now that elegance no longer protected embarrassment. "Privately was when you should have remembered whose house this was," she said. Julian's face tightened. "I was hosting a dinner for people who matter." Victoria's eyes flicked toward her mother's portrait, then back to him. "And you let her humiliate the woman whose house made the dinner possible." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Serena swallowed and tried to recover a trace of dignity. "I did not know the legal details," she said. Victoria turned to her at last. "No," she replied. "You only knew where you wanted to sit." The silence after that was clean, almost merciful. Mrs. Whitcomb stepped to the head chair and pulled it out for Victoria. It was the same chair Margaret Ashford had used for family holidays, scholarship dinners, memorial toasts, and the long winter evening when Victoria signed her first trust papers with tears drying on her face. Victoria placed one hand on the chair back before sitting, not as a display, but as a greeting. The wood was warm from Serena's borrowed confidence. It would cool. Julian moved closer, lowering his voice. "Do not do this in front of everyone." Victoria looked up at him. "You did." He had no answer. Thomas Reed gathered the estate notice, but left a copy on the table where the guests could see the letterhead. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded to the staff, and the dinner service resumed, not for Serena, not for Julian, but under Victoria's command. The first course arrived in porcelain bowls with the old Ashford crest facing the proper direction. The Montrechaut stayed in the cooler. The Sancerre was poured because Victoria gave one small nod. At the edge of the room, Serena reached for her clutch. No one stopped her. No one needed to. She walked past the head chair without looking at it, past the staff who had never belonged to her, past the portrait of the woman whose legacy she had called cold. When she reached the doorway, she paused as if expecting Julian to follow. He did not move. That was his punishment, though Victoria had not chosen it for him. He remained standing in the dining room, surrounded by investors who now understood that the grandeur they admired had not been his. Victoria unfolded her napkin and placed it in her lap. The house settled around her. Silver, candlelight, rain against the windows, staff standing ready, her mother's portrait above the sideboard watching like memory made visible. Julian whispered, "Victoria, what happens now?" She lifted her glass, not in celebration, but in closure. "Now," she said, "this house stops pretending." Then she looked down the long table where her name sat at the head again, printed in black ink, steady beneath the chandelier. They thought she had lost the room. The house had only been waiting for her to enter.